I made a mid-career jump from a non-technical field into software engineering over the course of 2 years. If you're thinking about making a similar career jump, here is precisely how I did it. Let's rewind the clocks to 2015. I was working in an entirely non-technical role as a management consultant in Washington, D.C. Code was Greek to me. I didn't understand the first thing about it. However, I did have a vague understanding that code was important and that perhaps I would benefit from learning more about it. I can still remember the exact moment that sparked my interest. I was working late in the office, working on an Excel financial model, and I was getting really into it. I was a bit of a nerd like that. I still am a bit of a nerd like that. So I was working on this Excel financial model when a software engineering manager kind of walks by and sees how into this Excel model I'm getting and says, hey, if you like building things in Excel, you might like building them in code. And it turns out he is precisely correct. So, if you're considering the jump into software engineering, something like Excel can be a good proxy to suggest that it might be something you'll actually enjoy. But it's not just Excel. Really, anything you work on that involves both analytics and building things, kind of a process of analytical creation, can serve as a good proxy for what the experience of software engineering is like and could suggest to you that perhaps it's something that you would enjoy. Another fantastic spark for getting into software engineering is just finding a problem in your life that can be solved via code and then using that as what drives your coding education. Having a real problem to work on is exceptionally good for a few reasons. First, it helps you get used to the idea of code as a means to an end, rather than sort of an end in itself, which can be a result of following tutorials. Additionally, you actually learn how to build real things, which is a challenging and difficult skill to build and is not frequently taught via online tutorials. So having real projects that solve real problems can be a great way to kind of first spark your interest and then guide your journey as you learn more. These aren't the only things that are predictive of liking programming, but there are a few things to keep in mind as you consider whether or not you want to begin this journey. One of the best places for learning how to be a software engineer is the internet. Or at least it's the most cost-effective place to learn how to be a software engineer. In fact, there are people that just use the internet to make the entire career transition into software engineering. It can be done. It wasn't my path, but it happens. It is quite challenging though, so your mileage may vary if you just try to use the internet. There is a mountain of free material available online, and covering it all would be the work of multiple videos. But here are a few high-level highlights to consider as you navigate the internet. First, to be very concrete, I would strongly recommend just checking out Harvard's Introductory to Computer Science class, CS50. It is, in my opinion, the best free online resource for learning how to be a software engineer for a complete beginner. It doesn't require any prerequisites. I strongly recommend you check it out. And the reason it's so good is that more so than any other material I personally found online, it teaches you how to think like an engineer. Now, that's a bit of a buzz phrase, but it's the hardest part of being a software engineer. And here's an example to kind of illustrate what it means. Thinking like an engineer is not knowing how to write a loop. That's just the syntax of the language, and you should know it. Thinking like an engineer is knowing when to use loops, how to best use them, when not to use them. All of these more complicated questions that operate around the structure of the loop. Understanding all of that, that's thinking like a software engineer. Understanding how to actually build something, what different components can be put together to create larger things that can be put into even larger things. That's the thinking like a software engineer. My second piece of advice really just builds on that, and it's that there's a lot of material online that's just going to teach you syntax, or you're just going to be following along. I would stay away from anything that's just teaching you syntax, unless you really just need to learn syntax, then just, do that to learn the syntax. And if you're just following along but not actually problem solving, I would be very skeptical of how much it's teaching you. Perhaps following along works for your very first time through material, But programming is best learned by doing, and doing on your own as much as you can without help and assistance. That very challenging process of figuring things out for yourself, that's where the best learning will happen. Finally, at least for me, I found it motivating to have people to go through these courses and materials with. So find some friends online, find some friends in real life, see if you can harass them into taking a programming course with you, find a community that's focused on the course, perhaps try and learn along with them. Any way you can incorporate a communal element can be very, very helpful from both a motivational perspective and just a learning perspective. It can help you get other perspectives and pick up things that you may not have noticed yourself. Finally, I do want to say that though I principally focused on the internet as my resource, you can duplicate a lot of what's done via the internet via textbooks. And there are those that think textbooks are generally a better approach than using the internet. So consider that as an alternative. However, as I mentioned, the internet wasn't the final phase for me. Here's what came next. This step won't be available to everyone, and it will depend on where you work. But if you work with software engineers or know them, they too can be a fantastic resource for learning more about software engineering. If only because a lot of software engineers just like to talk about software engineering and like to teach others. You might be surprised with how much interest there is in helping you out in your learning process. I was fortunate enough in the company I worked at in 2015 and 2016 to have some software engineers there that liked teaching enough that they actually put on a weekly just instructional session for their colleagues where you could show up and they would help teach you about this and that within programming. Perhaps you could get something like that set up at your company, or perhaps you could get something like that set up with some of your friends, or perhaps you can just go to them as a resource from time to time to answer questions that you may have. But software engineers are a great resource for learning about software engineering. Additionally, this could be another angle to actually make the career transition into software engineering. If you are learning from your software engineers at your job, you could potentially volunteer to help them out in your free time as an opportunity to A, learn more about software engineering, and B, prove your stuff. If you actually can prove that you know how to code and you get to that point where you can do it, an internal transfer is not necessarily impossible. Now, this is obviously going to depend on where you work and what the culture is like, but this is another path into software engineering that I personally have seen work. But it was not my path. I had a final step after even this one. Let's take a look. Come 2017, I had been dabbling in software engineering for about a year and a half, and I knew at that point that it was something I really wanted to do. I had seen a few of my friends go through the bootcamp process and have it work out pretty well for them, so I decided that I wanted to go through the bootcamp process as well. So I did. Now, if you want to go down the bootcamp road, you do need to be careful in how you evaluate your bootcamps. There are a lot of snake oil salesmen out there that are not going to give you a particularly great education. That said, I think it is fairly easy to get a decent sense of how well the students are doing. There are two statistics you want to look for, and ideally, you want to see that they're being published. And if they're not being published, this should be a big red flag for you in terms of evaluating that bootcamp. So, the two evaluation statistics are hiring rate within some span of time, how many folks are hired within 6 months, within a year, and what is the average starting salary. If those two statistics are published, and better yet than even being published, if they are published and independently audited, you can have a lot of confidence in the outcomes of students that attend that bootcamp. If that information is not available, that is a cause for concern and something you should ask them about. Try and understand, in a very concrete sense, how well students are doing after they graduate. Additionally, it's important to understand that the bootcamp market evolves quickly over time. I went through it in 2017, but there is some evidence that suggests that things have already gotten harder for bootcamp grads since 2017. All of this said, I think bootcamps can be a fantastic investment if you do your research and due diligence. It's an opportunity to be fully immersed in a coding environment, surrounded by people that are taking it very seriously, and that is extremely motivational, or at least it was for me. Now, oh yes, and for reference, I attended Hack Reactor back in 2017, but they've since been purchased by Galvanize, so I can't speak to the current quality of the education. Once you're done with the boot camp, it is time for the job hunt. I'm going to save the specifics for how I approached the job hunt for its own video, but in a nutshell, after a year and a half of programming in my free time and 3 months of boot camp, I was able to get hired on a job as a software engineer within 6 weeks, which was a very tight timeline for my cohort. That was fast. You should not necessarily expect it to be the same speed, but yes, I got a job in 6 weeks, and I will talk more about how I did that in a future video. If you've stuck around this long and you think you've gotten anything out of this video, please consider leaving a like, comment, subscribe if you're interested in seeing more. And we'll be putting out more content like this. In any case, thank you so much. Have a great day and peace.